Welcome to the Sleepy Scholar, where curious minds drift off to fascinating facts and the world's greatest mysteries. Before we begin, take a moment to like and follow to uncover so much more of the world's conspiracies. Tonight, we journey into a wilderness larger than most countries, where thousands have vanished without explanation, where ancient legend and modern statistics somehow arrive at the same unsettling place. This is the Alaska Triangle. So settle in, relax, and let your curiosity drift into the dark. This is the Sleepy Scholar. The Alaska Triangle has no fixed legal boundary, but the shape most commonly used connects 3 points: Anchorage in the south-central part of the state, Juneau along the southeastern panhandle, and Utqiagvik, formerly known as Barrow, the northernmost city in the United States, perched on the Arctic coast. The triangle formed by these 3 points encloses roughly a third of the entire state, a stretch of wilderness so vast that Alaska itself, at over 663,000 square miles, is larger than Texas, California, and Montana combined. Only about 730,000 people live across the entire state, giving Alaska one of the lowest population densities of any place in North America. Roughly 1.2 people per square mile, compared to over 90 per square mile nationally. The event that gave this region its modern notoriety happened on October 16, 1972. A twin-engine Cessna 310 departed Anchorage bound for Juneau, carrying 4 men: U.S. House Majority Leader Hale Boggs, Alaska Congressman Nick Begich, Begich's aide Russell Brown, and pilot Don Johns. Boggs had been in Alaska campaigning on Begich's behalf. The aircraft never arrived. What followed was, at the time, the largest search and rescue operation in United States history. Sources placed the effort at roughly 40 military aircraft and 50 civilian planes, alongside numerous boats, covering a search area estimated between 32,000 and 325,000 square miles, depending on the source, over more than 3,600 hours of searching across 39 days. No wreckage, no debris, and no remains were ever recovered. The Air Force officially suspended the search on November 24, 1972. A detail rarely included in shorter retellings. Nick Begich's name remained on the ballot for Alaska's congressional seat in the general election held less than a month after his disappearance, on November 7, 1972. He won. Begich defeated Republican challenger Don Young, while officially still classified as missing, since he had not yet been legally declared dead. Congress didn't declare the seat vacant until January 1973, triggering a special election that Don Young ultimately won, a race that gave Young a seat he would hold for the next 49 years, until his own death in 2022, making him the longest-serving Republican in House history. Boggs's disappearance fueled its own separate strand of speculation, unrelated to anything about Alaska's wilderness at all. Boggs had served on the Warren Commission, the body established to investigate the assassination of President John F. Kennedy, and had reportedly grown skeptical of some of the commission's own conclusions in the years before his disappearance, occasionally hinting publicly at disagreements with the official findings. Some conspiracy theories from the era proposed that Boggs's death was connected to this descent, or even implicated FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover, with whom Boggs had a documented and increasingly public political conflict in his final years. No evidence has ever substantiated either claim, and the leading non-conspiratorial explanation remains straightforward. A small aircraft, flying through mountainous terrain in Alaska's notoriously unpredictable autumn weather, went down somewhere in over 300,000 square miles of wilderness, and was never found, a scenario with no shortage of precedent in the region, before or since. The number most frequently cited for the Alaska Triangle's broader disappearance rate is that more than 16,000 people have gone missing in the region since 1988, or, in some tellings, more than 20,000 since the Boggs-Begich disappearance in 1972, a rate reportedly more than double the national average. It's worth handling this statistic carefully, because its exact sourcing is considerably murkier than the confident, round numbers suggest. The figure traces back loosely to aggregated Alaska State Troopers missing persons data, but no single, precisely cited government report actually states 16,000 or 20,000 as a defined total specifically within the triangle's boundaries. The number appears to have been assembled and popularized largely through documentary and journalistic retellings, most notably a 2018 History Channel special titled The Alaska Triangle, which did more than perhaps any single source to cement the modern name and its accompanying statistics in public awareness. What is independently verifiable, through Alaska's own Department of Public Safety, is that Alaska consistently reports missing person rates well above the national average, with some analyses estimating 500 to 2,000 new missing person cases statewide in any given year. A significant and often underexamined component of that real statistic involves Alaska Native communities specifically. Alaska has one of the highest per capita rates of missing and murdered Indigenous persons of any state in the country, a crisis that has drawn increasing attention from state task forces and federal agencies in recent years, including a dedicated Not Invisible Act commission established by Congress in 2020. This is a genuine, documented, and ongoing statistical pattern, one rooted in complex factors including remote geography, under-resourced rural law enforcement, and long-standing jurisdictional gaps between tribal, state, and federal authority, rather than anything mysterious about the land itself. Alaska's terrain supplies no shortage of mundane, well-documented explanation for high loss rates more broadly. The state contains more than 3 million lakes, over 100,000 glaciers, and mountain ranges including Denali, the tallest peak in North America at over 20,300 feet. Terrain capable of generating localized, rapidly shifting weather systems that can turn from clear skies to whiteout conditions within minutes, catching even experienced pilots and hikers by surprise. Denali carries its own well-documented danger record, entirely apart from the Triangle's broader mythology. Since climbing records began in 1932, more than 100 climbers have died attempting to summit the mountain, and the National Park Service reports a summit success rate of roughly 50% in an average year, meaning half of all climbers who attempt it, using modern equipment and modern forecasting, still fail to reach the top. The aviation statistics behind Alaska's reputation are precise, current, and genuinely striking. According to the National Transportation Safety Board, Alaska's total aviation accident rate between 2008 and 2017 ran 2.35 times higher than the rest of the country combined, with its fatal accident rate running 1.34 times higher. In 2016 alone, Alaska accounted for 5.4% of all fatal aviation crashes in the entire United States, despite holding roughly 0.2% of the national population. Over 1% of Alaska's population holds a pilot certification, 6 times the national rate, largely because only about 18% of Alaskan communities are connected by road at all. Juneau, the state capital, cannot be reached by car from Anchorage under any circumstances, since the only way in or out is by boat or plane. CDC occupational data from the 1990s found Alaska's pilot fatality rate ran at 268 per 100,000, more than double the national pilot fatality rate, and identified aviation as the second leading cause of on-the-job death in the entire state, trailing only commercial fishing. A factor cited repeatedly by the NTSB is Alaska's limited ground-based radar and radio infrastructure. Many remote stretches of the state simply aren't covered by the kind of tracking systems pilots in the lower 48 rely on routinely, meaning an aircraft in trouble can vanish from any monitoring system entirely, long before anyone on the ground realizes something has gone wrong. Alaska's own aviation authorities didn't simply accept these numbers passively. Beginning in 1999, the FAA launched a research program called Capstone, installing GPS-based mapping and a tracking technology called Automatic Dependent Surveillance Broadcast, or ADSB, into aircraft across western and southeast Alaska. Targeting the exact technology gap the NTSB had identified as a major contributing factor to the state's crash rate. The results were dramatic. A 2004 University of Alaska and MITRE Corporation study found a 40% reduction in accidents among Capstone-equipped aircraft compared to unequipped ones. And the Alaska Department of Transportation later reported an overall 47% reduction in the regional accident rate. Capstone proved so effective that the FAA adopted its core technology nationwide, rebranding it as NextGen, meaning a safety program born specifically out of Alaska's uniquely dangerous flying conditions now underpins commercial aviation tracking across the entire United States. It's a detail almost never mentioned in popular retellings of the Alaska Triangle. The very same conditions that produced the region's frightening reputation also produced one of modern aviation's more significant safety innovations. Long before any modern statistic or documentary gave this region its current name, Alaska Native cultures across the southeastern panhandle, including the Tlingit, Haida, and Tsimshian peoples, held their own explanation for people vanishing into the wilderness, particularly near water. The Kushtaka, sometimes translated as land otter man, is described in Tlingit oral tradition as a shape-shifting being capable of taking human or otter form, said to lure travelers, particularly those who were drowning, lost, or in distress, away from safety, sometimes transforming them into Kushtaka themselves. In some tellings, the Kushtaka's cries mimic the voice of a loved one or a crying baby, drawing victims toward the water rather than away from danger. Traditional protections against the Kushtaka reportedly included carrying items associated with dogs, since dogs were believed to frighten the creature away, a detail rarely included in popular retellings of the legend. This is a genuine, centuries-old element of indigenous belief, not a modern invention grafted onto the mystery after the fact, and it deserves to be understood on its own cultural terms rather than folded indiscriminately into a media-driven mystery zone narrative that didn't exist until the 20th century. Further north and west, among Inupiat communities along the Arctic coast near Utqiagvik itself. One of the triangle's three defining points, the Aurora Borealis carried its own long-standing set of beliefs, distinct from the Kushtaka legends of the southeast. Some Inupiat oral traditions describe the lights as the spirits of the dead playing games in the sky, and traditionally warn children against whistling at the aurora, believing the lights could descend and take a person away in response. Unlike the Kushtaka, which explains disappearance through deception and luring, this tradition frames the aurora as a more direct, active force, a separate thread of belief from a distinct Alaska Native culture, arriving independently at a similar underlying theme: the northern wilderness as a place capable of reaching out and taking someone. One of the earliest cases to establish this region's reputation predates even the Boggs Begic disappearance by nearly a quarter century, and contains a detail that connects directly back to the Inupiat aurora traditions just mentioned. On March 12, 1948, Northwest Orient Airlines Flight 4422, a Douglas C-54 carrying merchant mariners home from Shanghai, crashed into Mount Sanford in the Wrangell Mountains, killing all 30 people aboard. The wreckage, though briefly spotted from the air immediately after the crash, was buried by snowfall before it could be reached and remained lost for over 50 years, until two off-duty commercial pilots, Mark Milliken and Kevin McGregor, finally located and confirmed the debris field on the mountain's glacier in 1999. Recovering, among the wreckage, human remains still preserved in the ice. The Civil Aeronautics Board's original investigation listed the crash's probable cause as the pilot's failure to see Mount Sanford through cloud cover. But McGregor and Milliken's later research uncovered something the official report only mentioned in passing. The aurora borealis was reported as unusually bright that specific night, and the investigators who later studied the case suspected the pilots may have been visually disoriented by the lights themselves, potentially contributing to their failure to see the mountain in time. It's a rare case where a real, documented aviation investigation seriously considered the aurora borealis as a literal contributing factor in a crash. Not folklore, but an actual line of inquiry pursued by accident investigators. A decade later, in August of 1958, a small Grumman Goose aircraft carrying Clarence J. Rode, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service's regional director for Alaska, along with 2 other passengers, disappeared over the eastern Brooks Range in Alaska's remote north. A large search effort found nothing. It wasn't until August 23, 1979, 21 years later, almost to the day, that hikers stumbled onto the wreckage in steep, previously unsearched terrain, finally allowing investigators to determine the plane had struck a rock wall in poor visibility. 2 decades of uncertainty, resolved not by any new technology or breakthrough, but by hikers who simply happened to walk through the right stretch of wilderness. One of the more recently resolved cases connected to this region involves Gary Frank Southerton, a 25-year-old New Yorker who vanished during a hunting trip in the Alaskan wilderness in the mid-1970s. In 1997, a human skull was discovered along the Porcupine River, a remote waterway in Alaska's northeast interior near the Canadian border. It went unidentified for 25 years. In 2022, nearly 5 decades after Southerton disappeared, DNA analysis finally confirmed the skull belonged to him, closing one of the region's long-open cases through exactly the kind of patient, decades-later forensic work that resolved the SS Cotopaxi's identity in our earlier journey through the Bermuda Triangle. On July 4, 2012, 66-year-old Anchorage businessman Michael Paul Lemaitre entered the Mount Marathon race in Seward, Alaska, for the first time in his life. The race, held annually since 1915 and inducted into the Alaska Sports Hall of Fame in 2011, sends competitors nearly 3,000 vertical feet up a mountain overlooking Resurrection Bay and back down again, along a course with no marked trail. Runners simply choose their own path over rock, scree, and mud. Lemaitre was last seen by course volunteers around 6 in the evening, near the turnaround point at roughly 3,000 feet elevation, in worsening fog and rain. He gave a volunteer his bib number, 548, and radioed ahead that he'd be down within 90 minutes. He was never seen again. The search that followed grew to nearly 70 people, including the Alaska Mountain Rescue Group, search dogs, and the Alaska Air National Guard, and continued for 11 days before being scaled back due to deteriorating conditions. No clothing, no clue, no trace was ever recovered. Notable given that Lemaitre had been wearing black shorts and a black t-shirt, and vanished along a course that same day, drew hundreds of runners and thousands of spectators within less than a mile of where he was last seen. He was declared dead a month later, in August 2012, becoming the race's first confirmed fatality in its 97-year history at that point. His family later reached a settlement with the Seward Chamber of Commerce, the race's organizer, in 2014. In the aftermath, Mount Marathon organizers introduced new safety requirements, including mandating that all entrants formally attest, in front of other competitors, that they had already walked the full course before being allowed to race it. A far more precise and independently verifiable statistic than the widely repeated 16,000 since 1988, or 20,000 since 1972 figures comes from Alaska's own state government. According to the Alaska Governor's Office and Alaska State Troopers Missing Persons Clearinghouse, the state logged 2,833 missing person reports in 2007 alone, in a state with a population of roughly 670,000 at the time, a rate of approximately 4 missing persons per 1,000 residents in a single year. That same year, state troopers also conducted 42 search and rescue missions for overdue hikers, 85 for overdue boaters, and 100 for overdue snowmobile operators. Unlike the vaguer multi-decade totals that dominate popular retellings, this is a specific, sourced single-year government figure, and it independently confirms that Alaska's missing persons rate is genuinely elevated, without needing to rely on the murkier aggregate statistics documentary producers have popularized since. The Alaska Triangle, as a named media concept, has actually been packaged for television more than once, predating the widely cited 2018 History Channel special by several years. In 2015, the Vice-affiliated network Viceland aired a 13-episode documentary series called Missing in Alaska, in which investigators worked case by case through the region's disappearances, examining evidence and local folklore in an attempt to determine the most plausible explanation for each one. The show completed only a single season. The 2018 History Channel special that most people now associate with the Alaska Triangle name was, in that sense, the second major television attempt to brand this same stretch of wilderness with the same basic formula already used for Bermuda decades earlier. Investigators, unresolved cases, and a menu of theories ranging from mundane to supernatural, presented without settling on any one explanation. Those theories, as cataloged across the documentaries, tend to cluster into a familiar handful. Some proponents describe the region as containing energy vortexes, concentrations of electromagnetic disturbance said to interfere with navigation, communication, or even the passage of time itself, a claim structurally identical to Ivan Sanderson's vile vortices theory from our earlier journey through the Bermuda Triangle, and equally unsupported by any measured peer-reviewed data. Others point to the region's genuinely elevated rate of UFO sighting reports, treating Alaska's remoteness and its history of Cold War-era radar and interceptor activity as evidence of extraterrestrial rather than terrestrial secrecy. A smaller but persistent contingent points to Bigfoot-like cryptid sightings as a contributing explanation for missing hikers specifically. That last claim connects to genuine, centuries-old indigenous folklore distinct from the Tlingit-Kushtaka legend discussed earlier. Along the southern Kenai Peninsula, the Sugpiaq and Alutiiq peoples have long told of the Nantianak, sometimes rendered Nantinak, a massive, hairy, human-like being said to possess supernatural abilities, including the power to vanish without leaving tracks. The legend is tied specifically to a real physical place, Portlock, also called Port Chatham, a fishing village on the southern tip of the Kenai Peninsula that was gradually abandoned by its Alutiiq residents through the 1940s. Oral tradition attributes the abandonment directly to a series of mysterious deaths and disappearances blamed on the Nantianak, severe enough that residents reportedly enforced a nightly curfew and armed patrols before ultimately relocating to the nearby village of Nanwalek. Today, Portlock survives only as a ghost town, its cannery, school, and post office left standing and slowly decaying for roughly 80 years. Visited mainly by researchers and, more recently, by a 2021 Discovery Plus series called Alaskan Killer Bigfoot, which sent a crew including Nanwalek resident Keith Seville, a descendant of the village's original inhabitants, to spend time searching the abandoned settlement. This is a real place with a real, documented history of abandonment, wrapped in oral tradition that long predates any television crew's interest in it, and it deserves to be understood as genuine cultural heritage before it's treated as content for a paranormal reality show. Related but distinct traditions of hairy, human-like wilderness beings appear across multiple, separate Alaska Native cultures, which is itself worth noting. The Alutiiq of the Kodiak Archipelago and Prince William Sound call similar beings Alaq or Aralaq, loosely, the ones who run away, while other regions use the term Uraali, sometimes rendered in English simply as hairy man. Alutiiq oral history offers its own internal explanation distinct from a literal unknown species. Some accounts describe these beings as originating from people who committed serious crimes and were banished from their villages, condemned to live alone in the wilderness until they transformed into something no longer fully human. A folkloric function closer to moral warning and social enforcement than cryptozoology in the modern sense. Similar in structure to how many cultures worldwide have used wilderness monster stories to discourage venturing too far from the safety of the group. A more recent case follows a similarly unsettling pattern. On June 3, 2019, 39-year-old Shauna Marie Oman of Eagle River left a friend's residence off McGrath Road in Fairbanks at 12:30 in the morning, planning to get a ride home later that day. When she didn't return, her friend assumed she had made other arrangements, and it wasn't until her roommate in Eagle River called days later, asking why she hadn't come home, that anyone realized she was actually missing. Troopers eventually traced her to a cabin near mile 23 of Chena Hot Springs Road, where the property owner confirmed she had been there but said she had simply walked away on June 4th. Her cell phone, its battery reportedly dying, sent its last recorded ping from a cell tower near mile 17 of the same road that same day. She left behind her belongings, her money, and her dog. Alaska State Troopers, paused search and rescue dogs, and a trooper helicopter searched the surrounding area, which borders the Chena River, and found nothing. Oman remains missing. Chena Hot Springs Road itself carries a locally noted history beyond Oman's case. In 2009, 40-year-old Samantha Lee Randolph disappeared after apparently losing control of her vehicle near the road in sub-zero temperatures. Her body was found 6 days later in a roadside ditch, a resolution that came only after a passerby discovered her purse nearby. Local news outlets covering the area's pattern of disappearances have noted that the corridor has produced multiple missing person cases over the years. Not because the road itself is unusual, but because it represents exactly the kind of transition zone common throughout the state. A paved route that quickly gives way to genuine backcountry, heavily used by both residents and visitors unfamiliar with how quickly conditions along it can change. The 2018 History Channel special that popularized the modern Alaska Triangle branding featured cryptozoology researcher Ken Gerhard as one of its investigators, who described the experience of researching the region as personally unsettling, telling the network that 2 separate disappearances, one person vanishing from a cruise ship, another from a crowded tourist overlook, reportedly occurred while his team was actively filming in the area. Gerhard's broader conclusion, as quoted afterward, was that a meaningful number of the cases he examined legitimately could not be solved through conventional explanation, involving people who were simply going about ordinary activities rather than undertaking any unusual risk, and who nonetheless vanished without a clear cause. It's worth weighing that conclusion, offered by a researcher whose professional background is in cryptozoology rather than search and rescue statistics or forensic investigation, against the same body of aviation, wilderness, and law enforcement data covered earlier in this journey. Data that again and again points toward Alaska's terrain, weather, and infrastructure gaps as sufficient explanation on their own, without requiring any of the vortex, cryptid, or extraterrestrial theories, layered on top of them by decades of documentary programming. Not every story along this same stretch of road ends without resolution. In August 2023, 2 Tennessee tourists, 50-year-old Jonas Bear and 37-year-old Cynthia Hovsepian, set out from the Chena Hot Springs Resort, the same general corridor where both Oman and Randolph vanished, for what they expected to be a 3-hour-day hike. A wildfire had burned through the area previously, leaving a landscape of downed, blackened trees that obscured the trail they'd intended to follow. Within hours, they were genuinely lost. What followed was an 8-day survival ordeal before Alaska State troopers and local volunteers located them alive. In a later interview with Fairbanks public radio station KUAC, the pair described the entire situation candidly as the result of simple bad choices, compounding gradually rather than any single dramatic event. Underestimating the terrain, misjudging how quickly a straightforward trail could become unrecognizable once the landscape itself had changed. Their survival, rather than their disappearance, is itself an instructive data point. The same conditions capable of erasing a person permanently can also, with enough resilience and enough luck, be survived for over a week by ordinary hikers with no wilderness training, which says as much about the genuine ruggedness of the terrain as any of the region's unresolved tragedies do. None of this folklore or theorizing requires an unexplained cryptid or energy field to account for genuine, tragic disappearances like Lemetre's. Search and rescue professionals who work in Alaska regularly point to a specific, well-documented combination of hazards behind cases like his. Hypothermia setting in rapidly once a person becomes wet and exhausted at elevation. Disorientation in fog thick enough to erase visual landmarks within yards, and terrain riddled with crevasses, unstable scree, and sheer drops that can conceal a body from searchers indefinitely, even within sight of a town. Christopher Solomon, writing an extensive 2016 investigation into the Lemaitre case for Runner's World, quoted a relative of Lemaitre describing the disappearance simply as "the mountain swallowed this man." A phrase that captures, in 5 words, the actual mechanism behind so much of what gets labeled mysterious in this region. Not supernatural intervention, but wilderness large enough, steep enough, and unforgiving enough to make even a well-populated race course as effective at erasing a person as the most remote stretch of tundra in the state. On November 17, 1986, Japan Airlines cargo flight 1628, a Boeing 747 carrying French wine from Paris to Tokyo via Anchorage, was crossing eastern Alaska near the Arctic Circle, roughly 30 miles southeast of Fort Yukon, when Captain Kenju Terachi and his 2 crew members observed 2 objects with rectangular arrays of glowing lights rise from below and pull alongside their aircraft. Terachi later described feeling heat from the object on his face when it drew closest, and a third, much larger object, which he later sketched for investigators as an enormous walnut-shaped craft dwarfing his own 747, appeared and remained visible for roughly 31 minutes before departing at high speed. What makes this case unusual within the broader history of aerial sightings is what happened next. The Anchorage Air Route Traffic Control Center's radar registered an intermittent, unidentified return near the aircraft's position at the same time, and separately, U.S. Air Force radar at Elmendorf Air Force Base was directed to scan the same area and also picked up a brief, unidentified primary return. For a period, the same unidentified contact was potentially being registered simultaneously on 3 separate systems: the aircraft's own onboard radar, FAA ground radar, and military radar. A level of multi-source corroboration rare in the history of aerial sightings. The FAA took the case seriously enough to formally investigate, interviewing all 3 crew members and compiling a report that wasn't finalized until March 5, 1987. John Callahan, who spent 6 years as division chief of the FAA's Accidents and Investigations branch, later gave testimony stating that he personally briefed a scientific study group connected to President Reagan's administration on the incident on January 5, 1987, and has claimed in subsequent years that the CIA ordered the underlying data classified after that briefing, an allegation that remains unverified independently. A prominent UFO skeptic, Philip Klass of the Committee for the Scientific Investigation of Claims of the Paranormal, publicly proposed that the crew had simply misidentified the planets Jupiter and Mars. Investigators who examined the geometry of the sighting pointed out a specific problem with that explanation. Jupiter and Mars were positioned in an entirely different part of the sky than where the crew reported seeing the objects, and the objects were described moving between formations, stacked vertically, then side by side, in ways stationary planets cannot do. The FAA's own final, official conclusion was simply that investigators were unable to confirm the object's identity. In 2023, journalist John Greenewald, after a 17-year Freedom of Information Act pursuit, obtained a fuller set of the original FAA case records, some of which had reportedly been marked as destroyed decades earlier, allowing researchers to review the case with more complete documentation than had been publicly available at any point in the intervening 37 years. It remains, by the standard of radar corroboration and witness credentialing alone, one of the most substantively documented unresolved aerial sightings in FAA history. A genuinely different category of case than folklore or vague statistical claims, resting instead on contemporaneous instrument data logged by 3 separate government and commercial systems. Wildlife poses its own well-documented, statistically measurable risk across the same region, entirely apart from either aviation hazards or any paranormal theory. Alaska is home to roughly 100,000 black bears, 30,000 brown bears, and a small population of polar bears along the Arctic coast, giving the state the largest bear population of any in the country by a wide margin, and making it the only U.S. state home to all 3 native bear species simultaneously. A formal epidemiological review conducted by the Alaska Division of Public Health covering 2000 through 2017 found that 68 people were hospitalized across 66 unique bear attacks during that 17-year span, averaging 3.8 hospitalizations per year, with 10 fatalities resulting from 8 unique attacks, 70% involving brown bears and 30% black bears, and roughly half of all attacks occurring in June alone. Despite holding a tiny fraction of the U.S. population, Alaska accounts for somewhere between 29 and 34.5% of all fatal bear attacks in the entire United States, according to separate analyses of the same underlying data, a genuinely disproportionate concentration explained almost entirely by sheer bear density rather than anything unusual about human behavior in the state. Specific, named cases illustrate how these statistics translate into real search and rescue outcomes. In October 2024, 50-year-old Tad Fujioka of Sitka failed to return from a solo hunting trip on Baranof Island in southeastern Alaska. Alaska wildlife troopers, the U.S. Coast Guard, and local search and rescue teams located his remains the following day, with investigators concluding he had likely been fatally mauled while a deer he'd killed was being scavenged by 3 brown bears spotted nearby from a Coast Guard helicopter. In 2021, a man survived being repeatedly stalked and attacked by a grizzly over several days in a remote area outside Nome before finally being extracted by aircraft. An ordeal that underscores how genuinely isolated some search and rescue responses in the state remain, even in the 21st century. And in July 2025, a woman hiking Anchorage's Dome Trail, within the city limits, was dragged off the trail by a brown bear. Anchorage police credited drone technology with helping locate her exact position during a roughly hour-long phone call with dispatchers, after which an Alaska State Troopers helicopter airlifted her to a hospital, where she survived with serious but non-life-threatening injuries. That contrast, a fatal mauling in true backcountry wilderness and a survivable one within an urban trail system, both within the same recent years, captures how unevenly Alaska's wilderness dangers are distributed even across supposedly safe and remote settings alike. The state's permafrost, a layer of subsurface soil that remains frozen year-round across much of Alaska's interior and north, introduces its own lesser-known hazard, distinct from anything involving weather or wildlife. Permafrost underlies approximately 80% of Alaska's total land area, and as it thaws, whether seasonally or due to long-term climate shifts, it can destabilize ground that appeared solid, creating sinkholes, slumping riverbanks, and unstable trail sections with little visible warning. The U.S. Geological Survey and university researchers studying the phenomenon have documented cases of roads, building foundations, and forest terrain shifting measurably within a single thaw season, sometimes dropping several feet as ice wedges beneath the surface melt and the ground above collapses into the resulting void, a process scientists call thermokarst. Search and rescue coordinators in interior Alaska have specifically cited thawing permafrost as a complicating factor in certain search efforts, since ground that was passable and accurately mapped 1 year can genuinely change shape, stability, and even drainage pattern by the next, rendering a hiker's own trip reports from a prior season unreliable for retracing a route. Long before satellite mapping or permafrost science existed, Alaska Native communities maintained sophisticated traditional knowledge systems for reading terrain, weather, and animal behavior that far predated any instrument-based forecasting available to outside visitors. Inupiat and Yupik hunters historically relied on detailed, generationally transmitted knowledge of ice conditions, wind patterns, and subtle sky coloration to predict weather changes hours or days in advance. Expertise that anthropologists and modern polar researchers have since studied specifically because of how consistently accurate it proved to be. In some documented comparisons, outperforming early-generation satellite forecasting models under certain localized Arctic conditions. This is worth holding alongside every disappearance discussed across this journey. Many of the visitors and even some longtime residents who have vanished in the region were operating with comparatively little of this accumulated, hyperlocal environmental knowledge, entering terrain that indigenous hunters had spent centuries learning to read safely. Search and rescue operations across this terrain depend on a patchwork of resources unlike almost anywhere else in the country. The Alaska Wing of the Civil Air Patrol, a volunteer auxiliary of the U.S. Air Force, conducts the majority of aerial search missions across the state's interior, flying small aircraft over terrain where scheduled commercial routes don't reach, and where ground teams would require days to cover the same distance a plane can search in hours. Alaska State Troopers, who serve as the primary law enforcement and search coordination authority across most of the state, oversee a jurisdiction covering territory larger than many entire regions of the continental United States, with a comparatively small number of officers responsible for responding across it. Response times that would be considered unacceptable delays in a densely populated state are, in large stretches of Alaska, simply the physical reality of distance. A trooper dispatched to a remote missing person report may need to travel by bush plane before a ground search can even begin, adding hours or days before the search itself starts, entirely apart from weather conditions that can ground aircraft for additional days at a time. Captain Tarachi's own career bore a direct cost from coming forward. After giving interviews to Kyoto News journalists in December 1986 without company authorization, Japan Airlines suspended him from active flight duties and reassigned him to a desk job, grounding for several years. A pilot with more than 10,000 hours of flight experience and a prior career as a fighter pilot, specifically for discussing the sighting publicly rather than through official channels alone. He was eventually reinstated and flew until his retirement, but the professional consequence he faced has since been cited repeatedly in later government hearings on aerial phenomena as an illustration of exactly the kind of career risk that discourages commercial pilots from reporting similar encounters. Notably, the JL 1628 case wasn't isolated. Within the following year, 2 additional unusual aerial sightings were reported over the same general Alaska corridor. One involving Alaska Airlines Flight 53, another involving a U.S. Air Force KC-135, though neither achieved the same level of radar corroboration or sustained investigation as the original case. Taken together, the JL 1628 encounter and Alaska's underlying wilderness statistics point toward 2 genuinely distinct categories of mystery within this single-named region, and it's worth holding them separately rather than blending them into one undifferentiated legend. One category involves cases with real, contemporaneous, cross-reference data. Radar returns, credentialed witnesses, formal government investigation that remain unresolved specifically because the available evidence, however substantial, still falls short of a confirmed explanation. The JL 1628 case belongs here. The other category involves disappearances and deaths that are statistically unsurprising once measured against Alaska's terrain. Weather, bear population, permafrost instability, and aviation infrastructure gaps, and that only appear mysterious when presented without that broader context. Tad Fujioka's death, examined in isolation, sounds tragic and strange. Examined alongside Alaska's disproportionate share of the nation's fatal bear attacks, it becomes a data point within an already well-documented pattern. Neither category requires borrowing explanations from the other. A radar-confirmed aerial encounter doesn't need Bigfoot to remain interesting, and a fatal mauling in genuinely hazardous bear country doesn't need an energy vortex to explain why it happened. Long before JL 1628's crew reported an unidentified radar contact near Elmendorf Air Force Base, that same stretch of Alaska sky had already been fitted with one of the largest radar networks ever constructed, built for an entirely different purpose. In 1953, the U.S. Air Force recommended a chain of early warning radar stations across northern Alaska and Canada, roughly along the 69th parallel, some 200 miles above the Arctic Circle. A project President Eisenhower approved in February 1954 and construction crews completed by July 1957. The result, called the Distant Early Warning Line, or DW Line, eventually comprised more than 60 manned radar installations stretching nearly 3,000 miles from northwestern Alaska to Baffin Island in eastern Canada, designed to give the United States a roughly 30-minute warning before a Soviet bomber strike could arrive. Building it required more than 25,000 construction workers and an estimated 460,000 tons of material, nearly all of it hauled in during the short Arctic summer by air or sled, since no roads existed to most of the sites. The prototype station was tested on Barter Island, off Alaska's north coast, a location that sits almost exactly at the triangle's northernmost point near Utqiagvik. For decades, this radar network, along with fighter interceptors kept on constant 15-minute alert at Elmendorf and other Alaska bases, meant that unusual radar returns, intermittent contacts, and genuinely classified aircraft activity were a routine, if secret, feature of exactly the airspace where so many of this region's unexplained aerial reports would later be logged. The DW line itself was gradually phased out starting in 1985, replaced by an upgraded system called the North Warning System. But its decades of operation offer a very concrete, very real answer to at least some of the mysterious radar clutter and electronic interference claims that circulate in popular retellings of the Alaska Triangle. A genuine, classified, continent-spanning military radar system was quietly running across this exact region for over 30 years. It's worth checking the Bigfoot and Nantianak folklore we've discussed against the same kind of formal documentation used for aviation and search and rescue data. The Bigfoot Field Researchers Organization, founded in 1995 and generally regarded as the leading formal clearinghouse for cryptid sighting reports in North America, has compiled more than 3,000 sighting reports nationally as of recent tallies, with cases logged across all 50 states. Of that entire national database, only 22 sightings have ever been formally documented in Alaska, spanning reports collected between 1985 and 2022. A strikingly small number compared to states like Washington, which alone accounts for over 2,000 reports, or Oregon, with more than 1,000. This is worth sitting with directly. Despite Alaska's outsized reputation in popular, mystery zone media, and despite the genuine depth of indigenous oral tradition surrounding beings like the Nantianakan Uraeli, the state ranks quite low by the very metric, a formal, standardized, nationally consistent sighting database that cryptid researchers themselves rely on most heavily. The gap between Alaska's cultural reputation for cryptid activity and its actual documented sighting count in the field's own primary data source is one of the more concrete illustrations, across this entire journey, of how a region's folklore fame and its measurable evidence base can diverge sharply from each other. Among the small number of Alaska cases that do appear in the BFRO database, one of the more frequently cited involves a truck driver's 2012 sighting along the remote highway corridor between Anchorage and Fairbanks, and a 2022 encounter reported by a hiker named Joe Morris near the Root Glacier, a location within Wrangell St. Elias National Park, the same park containing Mount Sanford, where Northwest Flight 4422 crashed in 1948. Wrangell St. Elias is itself worth knowing on its own terms. At over 13.2 million acres, it's the largest national park in the United States, larger than Switzerland, and contains 9 of the 16 tallest peaks in the country. A single national park, in other words, larger than an entire European nation, sitting almost entirely within the Alaska Triangle's boundaries, which helps explain both why a Bigfoot sighting and a 70-year-old plane crash could occur within the same relatively small pocket of it, and why so much of this park's interior has never been thoroughly searched by anyone at all, cryptid or otherwise. An earlier and separately documented Alaska cryptid case, sometimes cited alongside the BFRO's modern tally, comes from September 1998 near Bethel, in the state's southwest, where investigators recovered plaster casts of footprints measuring roughly 15 inches, reportedly showing dermal ridge detail, the fine skin texture patterns normally associated with genuine primate feet, a level of detail that has made the cast one of the more frequently discussed pieces of physical evidence in the field, without ever being independently authenticated as originating from an unknown species by mainstream primatology or forensic analysis. Fog and terrain were producing genuine, tragic confusion in this region, even before any Cold War radar existed to explain it. In May 1943, American forces landed on Attu Island, at the far western tip of the Aleutian chain, to retake it from occupying Japanese troops in what remains the only land battle of World War II fought on incorporated U.S. territory. Fog on Attu was reportedly thick enough that one soldier later described landing in conditions as thick as mashed potatoes, and multiple American troops were killed by friendly fire during nighttime engagements when confused, frightened soldiers, unable to see clearly, fired on their own comrades in the mist. The 18-day battle claimed 549 American lives and 2,351 Japanese lives, a toll that made it, proportionally, one of the deadliest engagements of the entire Pacific campaign. And yet it remains so obscure today that historians commonly refer to it as the Forgotten Battle. More than 80 years later, the fog and terrain are still yielding new discoveries. In July 2025, a research team located the wreckage of the Army vessel SS Delwood, which sank after striking a submerged rock column while laying communication cable near Attu. Found by coincidence, exactly 81 years to the day after it went down, its hull recorded by sonar in a severely disjointed state, more than 100 feet underwater. Even now, the remains of an estimated 2,600 Japanese soldiers are believed to still lie in unmarked graves in the island's boggy terrain, subject to periodic, ongoing recovery efforts by Japanese government teams working alongside U.S. officials. This corner of the Alaska Triangle's boundary, in other words, has its own entirely separate, well-documented history of loss driven by the same weather and terrain conditions responsible for so much of what gets attributed to the region's more modern mythology, measured not in decades, but in the better part of a century, and still, quite literally, being excavated. Alaska's Cold War radar legacy connects to one final, concrete piece of infrastructure worth naming plainly. Elmendorf Air Force Base, the same installation whose radar registered an intermittent return during the JL-1628 encounter, remains an active military installation today, now consolidated with the Army's Fort Richardson into Joint Base Elmendorf-Richardson, home to Air Force fighter squadrons on continuous alert status for exactly the kind of airspace monitoring the DW line was originally built to provide. The radar infrastructure, the fighter interceptors, and the broader air defense mission that shaped so much of what got reported as strange or unexplained in Alaska's skies throughout the Cold War didn't end when the Soviet Union dissolved. It simply continued under new names, new equipment, and reduced public visibility. Still quietly operating across the same stretch of sky this entire journey has spent so much time in tonight. No conversation about the Alaska Triangle's stranger theories gets very far before arriving at a real, physical facility tucked into the forest near Gakona, roughly 200 miles northeast of Anchorage. Its official name is the High-Frequency Active Auroral Research Program, universally shortened to HARP, and its actual stated purpose, jointly overseen for years by the Air Force, Navy, and University of Alaska Fairbanks before ownership transferred to the university alone in 2015, is to study the ionosphere, the electrically charged layer of Earth's upper atmosphere, by beaming high-frequency radio energy upward from a field of 180 towering antennas and observing how the ionosphere responds. That's the official version. The conspiracy version has grown into one of the most elaborate bodies of theorizing attached to any single facility in the country, sustained for decades by radio hosts, self-published researchers, and an enormous online ecosystem that treats the facility's remote location and military origins as proof of a hidden purpose far beyond basic atmospheric science. Believers have variously claimed HARP is a secret weather control weapon capable of engineering hurricanes and droughts on command, credited or blamed by various online communities for events ranging from Hurricane Katrina to the 2010 Haiti earthquake. A mind control device broadcasting subliminal frequencies into the general population, sometimes tied to reports of headaches or unusual symptoms among residents living near the facility. A weapon capable of triggering earthquakes and tsunamis on adversary nations from thousands of miles away. And closer to tonight's theme, a device whose electromagnetic output is directly responsible for the compass failures, radio static, and disorientation reported by pilots and hikers across the wider Alaska Triangle for decades, including, in some retellings, incidents that predate HARP's actual construction in the early 1990s by decades. A chronological problem that rarely slows down the theory's spread. HARP's operators and independent ionospheric physicists have repeatedly stated that its transmission power, while genuinely substantial for scientific research purposes, is many orders of magnitude too weak to influence weather systems, trigger seismic activity, or meaningfully affect a human brain from any distance. And the facility has hosted public open house tours specifically to counter the secrecy that fuels so much of its mythology, inviting visitors to walk directly among the antenna array itself. The theories persist regardless, In the same way Area 51's mythology persisted through decades of far more modest declassification, and HAARP remains, to this day, one of the most cited pieces of evidence in any broader discussion of why Alaska's skies might behave strangely. A related and older thread of theorizing holds that Alaska sits atop, or within, one of several global electromagnetic vortex points, structurally identical to the vile vortices theory Ivan Sanderson proposed for the Bermuda Triangle back in 1972, which placed 12 such points evenly spaced around the globe, several of them, according to Sanderson's original scheme, falling within or near Alaska's own high-latitude terrain. In the Alaska version, believers point to the region's genuine magnetic peculiarities. Its proximity to the North Magnetic Pole, which has itself been slowly drifting across the Canadian Arctic for over a century, sometimes cited by theorists as evidence that the entire vortex is itself in motion and the real, measurable auroral electrojet, a powerful natural electrical current that flows through the upper atmosphere during aurora displays, as evidence that something in the local electromagnetic environment is capable of disorienting instruments, aircraft, and even human perception of time itself. Proponents sometimes point to reported instances of watches stopping, batteries draining unusually fast, or compasses spinning freely as anecdotal support, framing each as a small, personal brush with the same underlying force believed to be capable of erasing a plane or a hiker entirely. It's worth holding two things side by side here. The magnetic pole's drift and the auroral electrojet are both entirely real, measured, published phenomena studied by mainstream geophysicists. The leap from those genuine phenomena to claims of compass scrambling, vortex energy capable of making planes vanish, is where the theory departs from the underlying science. In exactly the same pattern we traced through Bermuda's own vortex claims earlier in this journey. Alaska's extreme remoteness has made it fertile ground for a particular strain of UFO and alien base theorizing distinct from the JL 1628 case's radar-confirmed encounter. Some theorists point to the state's genuine concentration of restricted military airspace, a legacy of the DW line and its Cold War successors, and argue that at least some portion of it conceals not merely classified aircraft testing, but recovered or reverse-engineered extraterrestrial technology, echoing almost precisely the Area 51 mythology examined earlier in this series, simply transplanted to a colder, darker setting. Believers frequently cite the region's aurora displays themselves as camouflage, arguing that unusual lights genuinely observed in the sky could mask craft activity beneath them, a claim that, notably, cannot be disproven by pointing to the aurora's real physical cause, since the theory simply folds the aurora in as cover rather than treating it as competing explanation. A stranger and more recent theory claims that Alaska harbors not extraterrestrial visitors, but an entrance to something beneath the Earth itself. Hollow Earth theorizing traces back at least to 1818, when an American named John Cleves Sims Jr. publicly proposed that the planet was hollow and habitable, with massive openings at both poles. A claim later popularized further in fiction by writers like Jules Verne and Edgar Rice Burroughs, and eventually adopted by a persistent fringe of believers who treated it as literal geography rather than speculative fiction. Some modern adherents have specifically pointed to Alaska's own Arctic coastline as a plausible location for a polar entrance, citing the genuine, publicly acknowledged difficulty of fully mapping or monitoring some of its most remote northern stretches as circumstantial support, and occasionally drawing on decades-old, since debunked claims that Antarctic explorer Admiral Richard Byrd privately described flying beyond the pole into an inner world during a 1947 expedition, a claim with no basis in Bird's actual, extensively documented flight logs and public reports, which describe conventional polar exploration and nothing resembling an entrance to an inner Earth. Geologists have thoroughly demonstrated, through seismic wave studies of how vibrations travel through the planet's actual layered interior, that the Earth is solid rock and metal essentially all the way through, making a habitable hollow interior physically impossible. But the theory, like so many others in this genre, persists by treating scientific rebuttal as itself part of the cover-up rather than as a real answer. Perhaps the most distinctly Alaska-flavored theory, born directly from the region's genuine wilderness scale, holds that certain areas within the triangle contain literal time slip zones, where hikers who vanish for hours, days, or permanently haven't necessarily died or gotten lost in any ordinary sense, but have instead slipped into some kind of temporal displacement, potentially explaining a small number of cases where a missing person's remains, when eventually found, showed less decomposition than the elapsed time since their disappearance would typically suggest. This claim deserves particularly careful handling. Forensic decomposition rates vary enormously based on temperature, and Alaska's near-freezing or below-freezing conditions across much of the year can genuinely slow decomposition dramatically compared to temperate climate expectations. A well-documented forensic phenomenon that requires no time-slip theory whatsoever to explain. Cold storage, quite literally, is one of the oldest and most reliable methods humans have ever used to preserve organic material, and a body left in near-freezing Alaska wilderness for months can look, to an investigator accustomed to warmer climate cases, startlingly well-preserved for entirely mundane thermodynamic reasons. Long before airplanes gave this region its modern legend, an earlier and considerably larger wave of disappearance swept through the same territory, driven by gold rather than weather. Between 1896 and 1899, an estimated 100,000 prospectors set out for the Klondike goldfields, funneling through Alaska's own Chilkoot and White Pass trails out of the towns of Dyea and Skagway on their way north into Canadian territory. Of that entire wave, only 30,000 to 40,000 actually reached Dawson City, and of those, no more than about 4,000 ever struck gold at all, meaning the overwhelming majority of the 100,000 who set out simply vanished from the historical record in a much more mundane sense, turning back broke, disillusioned, or dead long before any census ever caught up with them. The trails themselves killed with a regularity that's startling by modern standards. On April 3, 1898, an event now known as the Palm Sunday Avalanche buried an estimated 65 stampeders beneath the snow of the Chilkoot Trail, despite warnings from local Tlingit packers, who had told the newcomers plainly that springtime was a known, dangerous season for exactly this kind of slide. The White Pass Trail earned its own grim nickname during the same years, Dead Horse Trail, after prospectors, desperate and untrained, overloaded and drove their pack animals across terrain the animals simply couldn't survive. More than 3,000 horses and mules died along that single route, and their bones reportedly remained visible along the trail for years afterward. Disease moved through the crowded, poorly ventilated mining camps, just as efficiently as the terrain claimed lives outdoors. Typhoid fever, meningitis, and pneumonia spread rapidly through cabins built far too close together on boggy tundra, with as many as 6 men crowded into a single 14 by 16-foot structure alongside their supplies and sled dogs. When gold was later discovered directly in the beach sands at Nome in 1899, triggering a second rush the following year that briefly swelled the town's population by roughly 20,000 people almost overnight, The National Park Service's own mortality records for the era list at least 87 deaths in Nome in 1900 alone, the overwhelming majority from typhoid, pneumonia, or tuberculosis rather than any dramatic wilderness misadventure at all. Genuine, unresolved disappearance was common enough along the Gold Rush trails that period accounts describe it almost as an expected hazard of the journey rather than a notable exception. One historical account of the era, focused specifically on the region's waterway travel, poses the same question this entire series has circled back to again and again. Many people simply vanished along the trail, with contemporaries left to wonder whether they'd fallen through river ice, drowned attempting the rapids, or simply changed their plans and walked away from the rush entirely without telling anyone where they'd gone. The Northwest Mounted Police, policing the Canadian side of the border crossing, eventually made it mandatory, starting in June 1898, for anyone attempting to run their boats through the particularly dangerous Miles Canyon and White Horse Rapids to either prove competency or hire a licensed professional pilot, a rule credited with preventing what would likely have been several hundred additional deaths, adopted only after the toll from ordinary, untrained river travel had already become severe enough to force the intervention. Not every gold rush death was accidental. The era produced its own well-documented violent crime, distinct from anything involving weather or terrain. In 1899, a man named George O'Brien murdered several victims along the gold rush trails for their money and belongings. The bodies, recovered only months after their initial disappearance, ultimately confirmed the extent of his crimes, and he was convicted of first-degree murder in June 1901 and executed by hanging that August. Archaeological excavation of a Klondike-era burial site, published in the Alaska Journal of Anthropology in 2012, later recovered several frozen, deeply buried graves containing individuals executed by hanging under the Northwest Mounted Police's own on-the-spot justice system, alongside the remains of others who had died in custody. Physical, exhumed evidence of exactly how violently the pursuit of gold could turn, layered directly into the frozen ground beneath trails still walked by hikers and tourists today. Separately, the Nome Gold Rush produced its own infamous political scandal when Alexander Mackenzie, a powerful North Dakota political operator, orchestrated a corrupt scheme using a compromised federal court to seize valuable gold claims out from under the miners who had legally staked them. A reminder that not everything lost to prospectors in this era was lost to the wilderness at all. Some of it was simply stolen through the ordinary, well-documented machinery of political corruption. All of this, the avalanche, the disease, the drownings, the murders, the theft, happened within the same geographic boundaries this entire journey has spent hours walking through, decades before Hale Boggs's plane ever left the ground, decades before Groom Lake or Harp or a single radar station existed anywhere in Alaska. It's worth ending here, on this older layer of history, because it reframes the entire premise one more time. Alaska's reputation for swallowing people whole didn't begin with Cold War secrecy or aviation statistics or cryptid folklore. It began, quite literally, over a century ago, with 100,000 ordinary people walking into exactly the same unforgiving terrain, for exactly the same very human reason, the hope of finding something valuable, and a meaningful number of them simply never being accounted for again. Every layer we've added since, the aircraft, the radar, the theories, the folklore, both indigenous and invented, has settled on top of ground that was already, long before any of it, in the business of taking people in and not giving all of them back. Not every disappearance this journey has covered involved a single person vanishing into fog or wilderness. One of the largest, most consequential displacements in the region's entire history happened all at once, ordered by the United States government itself, and it remains one of the least widely known chapters of American involvement in the Second World War. In June 1942, Japanese forces bombed Dutch Harbor and invaded the westernmost Aleutian islands of Attu and Kiska, the same invasion and battle discussed earlier in this journey. In response, the U.S. military ordered the evacuation of 881 Unangaks people, the indigenous residents of the Aleutian and Pribilof Islands, then commonly referred to as Aleuts, from 9 villages across the island chain. The evacuation was hasty and, by every surviving account, traumatic. Villagers were told to pack only what they could carry, often a single suitcase, and were loaded onto military transport ships, including the USAT Delaroff, which residents of St. Paul Island watched pull away from their dock in 1942, taking them roughly 1,500 miles from everything they'd known. At Atka, U.S. servicemen set fire to the village's homes and its church themselves, specifically to prevent the structures from being of any use to Japanese forces, meaning some evacuees watched their own homes deliberately burned by their own government as they were taken away from them. What awaited them in southeast Alaska was, by the government's own later internal review, shockingly inadequate. The Unangaks were housed in what officials called duration villages, abandoned salmon canneries, a herring saltery, and a decaying gold mine camp, distributed across 5 main sites including Funna Bay Cannery, Funta Bay Mine, Killisnoo, Burnett Inlet, and Ward Lake. These were, in the National Park Service's own documented description, rotting facilities with no plumbing, electricity, or toilets. Families of up to 28 people were sometimes crowded into single 15 by 20-foot structures. There was no running water in winter, no sewer system, no laundry or bathing facilities, and many buildings had no working electricity, heat, windows, or doors at all. Some had literal holes in the roof. Clean drinking water was scarce and often contaminated. The Unangaks, whose home islands are treeless, windswept, and open to the sky, found themselves suddenly confined beneath the dense, dark rainforest canopy of southeast Alaska, a landscape so unfamiliar that surviving accounts specifically describe the trees themselves as a source of claustrophobia and psychological distress layered on top of everything else they'd already lost. The human cost was severe and specifically documented. Roughly 10% of the interned Unangaks died during the 2 to 3 years they spent in these camps, from pneumonia, tuberculosis, and the general effects of malnutrition and inadequate shelter in a genuinely brutal climate. One evacuee, Bill Cherepanoff Sr. of Akutan, later described the experience directly. His wife and 4 children were, in his words, whipped away from their home, with all their possessions abandoned to the elements, and he recalled trying to convince himself the entire experience was a dream that couldn't really be happening to his family. The federal government, aware of how badly the internment was being handled even as it continued, launched an internal public relations effort specifically to counter growing criticism, publishing staged, idealized photographs of camp life in magazines and local papers to obscure the actual conditions survivors were describing in their own accounts. Despite everything, resistance and resilience ran through the entire ordeal. 25 Unangaks men enlisted in the U.S. Armed Forces, even while their own families remained interned under the same government's authority. And the tragedy intersected, in at least one documented case, with the more widely known internment of Japanese Americans under Executive Order 9066. Roughly 240 Japanese Alaskans were separately removed to mainland incarceration camps under that same order. and at least one unangax woman married to a Japanese-American man petitioned the government for permission to join her husband at the Minidoka camp in Idaho with her infant son, rather than remain separated from him during her own community's internment. A single family caught, quite literally, between two of the government's simultaneous, racially targeted wartime removal programs. The people of Attu Island suffered a distinct and even harsher fate. Because Attu was actually occupied by Japanese forces rather than evacuated by American ones, its unangax residents were themselves taken by the Japanese military and interned in Japan for the remainder of the war, under conditions that multiple historical accounts describe as considerably worse than what their relatives endured in the American camps in southeast Alaska, meaning a single indigenous community was effectively split by the war into two separate internments, one run by each side. Of the Pacific conflict, an almost unbelievably specific historical circumstance affecting one small chain of islands. When the war ended and evacuees were finally permitted to return home, several of the original 9 villages were never resettled at all. Bjorka, Kashega, and Makashin remain unoccupied to this day, their populations never restored after the forced removal scattered families, ended traditional subsistence patterns, and, in the case of those who died in the camps, permanently reduced the number of people who could have returned at all. This is worth holding alongside every other kind of disappearance covered across this entire journey. Not a mystery in any sense requiring explanation, but a fully documented, government-ordered displacement whose consequences are still physically visible today in the empty footprint of villages that once stood, inhabited, along the same islands where Northwest Flight 4422 later crashed, and where the Battle of Attu was fought, all within the same relatively narrow stretch of the Aleutian chain. This journey has returned to again and again tonight. The most recent large-scale transformation of this landscape had nothing to do with gold, war, or radar, and everything to do with oil. Following the 1968 discovery of massive petroleum reserves at Prudhoe Bay on Alaska's North Slope, and accelerated by the global fuel shortages that followed the 1973 Yom Kippur War, Congress passed the Trans-Alaska Pipeline Authorization Act, clearing the way for construction of an 800-mile, 48-inch diameter steel pipeline connecting Prudhoe Bay to the port of Valdez. Main construction ran from 1975 to 1977, crossed 3 mountain ranges and more than 800 rivers and streams, required the invention of entirely new engineering techniques to lay pipe across unstable permafrost without melting the ground beneath it, and ultimately cost roughly $8 billion, more than $42 billion in today's terms, making it, at the time, the largest privately funded construction project in the world. The human cost of building it was real and specifically documented. 31 to 32 workers, depending on the source, died in construction accidents over the project's main building period, a toll spread across a workforce that peaked at over 28,000 people and cumulatively employed more than 70,000 workers across the life of the project. The hazards were exactly what you'd expect from heavy industrial construction layered onto Alaska's existing wilderness dangers. Equipment malfunctions, falls, extreme cold, encounters with bears drawn to construction camps, and the constant underlying risk of avalanches and earthquakes in terrain that had never hosted this kind of industrial activity before. In July 1977, just days after the pipeline began operating, human error during an unpracticed emergency procedure caused an explosion and fire at Pump Station 8 that killed one worker and temporarily shut the entire pipeline down. A House investigation later, concluding that operators had simply failed to follow procedures they'd specifically drilled for over the preceding 10 weeks. Beyond the work sites themselves, the pipeline transformed nearby towns almost overnight, and Fairbanks in particular became, in the words of people who lived through it, something close to a modern gold rush boomtown. A former Fairbanks police officer recalled that the city had only 2 officers patrolling it before the project arrived. Within a short span, the sleepy permafrost town, as one account described it, filled with construction workers, union teamsters, labor organizers, and, inevitably, given the sudden concentration of cash, gamblers, bootleggers, sex workers, and organized crime figures drawn north by the same money as everyone else. Salaried workers could earn around $36,000 a year, roughly $190,000 in today's terms, for about 22 weeks of actual work annually, with free room and board and company-paid flights home between shifts. Skilled union welders, often recruited from Texas and Oklahoma, could pull in $2,000 a week at a time when welders in the lower 48 were earning about $1,000 a month. Though the schedule behind those wages was brutal, often 80-hour weeks stretched across 9 to 12 consecutive days before a short break. One bar owner from the era recalled an older pipeline worker walking into a Fairbanks bar with a thick wad of cash, ordering a drink, and dying right there at the bar. An anecdote locals told less as tragedy and more as simply characteristic of exactly how much money, exhaustion, and hard living were compressed into those few boomtown years. Camp life itself ranged enormously in scale, from small 250-person sites clustered around individual pump stations to an enormous 3,500-person terminal camp at Valdez. All of it built with essentially no pre-existing infrastructure to support it. Engineers involved in the project have specifically cited basic logistics, simply getting food, fuel, and materials to thousands of workers in places no one had ever built anything before, as the single hardest problem of the entire undertaking. Harder even than the engineering challenges of the pipeline itself. The pipeline's completion in July 1977 didn't end its relationship with the region's broader mythology of accident and misfortune, either. The same permafrost instability discussed earlier in this journey, ground that can shift, slump, or subside as buried ice melts, remains an ongoing engineering concern for the pipeline's above-ground supports even today, decades after construction, requiring continuous monitoring and periodic reinforcement precisely because the same terrain responsible for so many historical disappearances in this region is also, slowly and unglamorously, still shifting beneath one of the largest pieces of infrastructure ever built across it. For 68 years before the United States ever owned this territory, it belonged, at least on paper, to the Russian Empire. And the transfer of this land from indigenous control to Russian, and eventually American, hands involved its own violent, well-documented history, playing out in the same southeastern panhandle that forms one corner of the modern Alaska Triangle. Russian fur traders, known as Promyshlenniki, began pushing into Alaska from Siberia as early as 1741. Hunting sea otters for their extraordinarily valuable pelts, and by 1799 the newly chartered Russian-American Company, granted a sweeping colonial monopoly by the Tsar, established a fortified trading post called Redoubt St. Michael on the site of modern Sitka, under the direction of a colonial manager named Alexander Baranoff. The local Tlingit people, specifically the Kix.Adi clan, grew increasingly hostile toward the Russians over the following 3 years, driven by documented Russian practices including forced labor and the sexual abuse of Tlingit women, and by fear that the entire community would eventually be compelled into servitude under the Russian crown. On June 20th, 1802, Tlingit warriors led by a leader named Kalyan launched a coordinated assault on the settlement, while many of its men were away on a hunting expedition, burning the fort's buildings and workshops and killing an estimated 20 Russians and roughly 130 of their Aleut laborers. Accounts vary on the exact total, with some sources placing the combined toll closer to 150. Survivors escaped by boat to alert other Russian outposts, and the Tlingit, anticipating retaliation, built a new fortified position nearby, a palisade stronghold called Shurzhii now, sometimes translated as the Fortress of the Bears. That retaliation arrived 2 years later. In October 1804, Baranov returned to Sitka with a company warship, the Neva, and laid siege to the Tlingit fort in what became known as the Battle of Sitka. A 6-day engagement in which Tlingit defenders, having also acquired muskets and cannons through independent trade with British and American merchants, repelled several Russian assaults before ultimately withdrawing under the weight of sustained naval bombardment, with women and children retreating into the surrounding forest as the fighting continued. The battle marked the effective end of organized Tlingit military resistance to Russian colonization, and Baranov renamed the settlement New Archangel, which served as the capital of Russian America, a colonial holding that, at its furthest extent, included not just Alaska, but a fort near Bodega Bay and agricultural settlements south of California's Russian River. By the 1830s, Sitka's population had grown to roughly 1,300, with schools, Russian Orthodox chapels, and Baranov's own residence, later remembered as Baranov Castle. Though a Tlingit community continued living alongside the Russian settlement throughout the colonial period, trading fresh food and goods that the Russians, never fully self-sufficient in this climate, continued to depend on. For more than a century, the exact physical location of the Tlingit's wartime stronghold remained one of Sitka's own local historical mysteries. 19th and 20th century searches, including archaeological trenching in the 1950s and a National Park Service survey between 2005 and 2008 that recovered cannonballs and other battle-era artifacts, repeatedly failed to conclusively confirm the fort's precise footprint. It wasn't until 2019, when researchers from Cornell University and the National Park Service used ground-penetrating radar and other geophysical imaging technology to scan the site, including areas obscured by thick modern vegetation, that Shurzhii now's exact location was finally, confidently identified, with the findings published in 2021. It stands as one more example, alongside the SS Cotopaxi and the wreckage of Northwest Flight 4422, of a genuine historical mystery in this region resolved not through dramatic revelation, but through patient modern technology finally succeeding where generations of prior searchers had failed. Russia's ownership of Alaska ended in 1867, sold to the United States for $7.2 million in a deal finalized and signed at Sitka, in a transfer initially mocked in the American press as Seward's folly, after Secretary of State William Seward, who championed the purchase. American soldiers formally took possession of Russia's former claims that October, and Sitka served as the new territory's capital for its first years under American administration, though it would take another 17 years, until 1884, for Alaska to receive any organized civil government at all, an entire generation during which the territory was administered first by the Army, then briefly by the Treasury Department, and then by the Navy, with essentially no formal legal system connecting most of its population to the government that had just purchased the land beneath them. The pipeline discussed a little earlier in this journey eventually produced its own catastrophic disaster, 12 years after the last barrel of construction equipment was packed away. Just after 9 in the evening on March 23, 1989, The tanker Exxon Valdez left the Alaskan pipeline terminal at Valdez, carrying more than 53 million gallons of North Slope crude oil bound for Long Beach, California. A routine departure of exactly the kind that had already happened more than 8,700 times over the preceding 12 years without a single major incident. For minutes after midnight on March 24th, the ship struck Bligh Reef, a well-charted, well-known navigational hazard in Prince William Sound, tearing open its hull and spilling an estimated 11 million gallons of crude oil into the water. Figures that some later analyses have argued were conservatively low relative to the true scale of the release. The investigation that followed identified a specifically human cause behind the disaster. Captain Joseph Hazelwood, later found to have been drinking prior to departure, had left an unlicensed third mate steering the nearly 1,000-foot vessel at the time of the grounding. Hazelwood was ultimately acquitted of the felony charges brought against him, convicted only of a single misdemeanor negligence charge, fined $50,000, and sentenced to 1,000 hours of community service. A resolution that struck many observers, given the scale of what followed, as strikingly minor. The scale of the resulting environmental damage was almost impossible to overstate. The oil slick eventually spread across estimates ranging from 700 to 1,300 miles of Alaskan coastline, depending on the measurement method used, killing an estimated 250,000 seabirds, along with thousands of sea otters, seals, harbor porpoises, and whales, and devastating billions of salmon and herring eggs in waters that supported the region's commercial fishing economy directly. The remote location, accessible in many areas only by helicopter and boat, badly complicated cleanup efforts from the very first hours of the response, and government reports at the time noted that the ship's era of increasing automation, carrying a crew of just 19 to manage a cargo load that, decades earlier, similar tankers had required twice that many hands to handle, may have contributed to how thin margin for error had become aboard vessels of this size operating in genuinely difficult Alaskan conditions. Exxon ultimately settled related legal claims in 1991 for a combined total exceeding $1 billion, split across criminal fines, criminal restitution, and a civil settlement, while cleanup costs themselves ran into the billions more. No human deaths were directly caused by the spill itself, though 4 fatalities were later associated specifically with the cleanup operation that followed. More than 3 decades later, researchers have documented that pockets of the original crude oil remain physically present beneath certain beaches in Prince William Sound even now, and long-term studies of local sea otter populations have traced mortality patterns tied to lingering, sublethal oil exposure stretching across multiple decades after the original spill. The disaster reshaped maritime regulation in ways that persist today. In its aftermath, Congress passed the Oil Pollution Act of 1990, mandating the phase-in of double-hulled tanker construction, specifically to reduce the odds of a single-hull breach causing a spill of this scale again, along with more rigorous contingency planning requirements for oil transport routes throughout U.S. waters. Regulatory changes that Alaska's own congressional delegation has continued to mark publicly on the disaster's anniversary, describing it as a genuine turning point in how the nation approached the safe transport of the very resource that, 12 years earlier, had built an entire boomtown economy across the interior of the state. We touched earlier on Denali's roughly 50% summit success rate, but one single expedition, more than any other in the mountain's history, explains exactly why that number sits where it does. In July 1967, 2 separate climbing groups, 9 young men from Oregon and Washington, and 3 more from Colorado, after one of their own original four was sidelined by a car accident the day before departure. Merged into a single 12-person team now remembered as the Wilcox Expedition, named for its 24-year-old leader, Joe Wilcox, a graduate student at Brigham Young University. At the time, Denali had only ever been successfully summited by 213 people in its entire recorded climbing history, dating back to the mountain's first ascent in 1913. 11 of the 12 men reached the summit. Only 5 came back down alive. After the group signed off from the top on July 18th, one of the worst storms in the mountain's recorded history descended over the following days, with National Weather Service modeling later estimating wind gusts high on the peak reaching as high as 300 miles per hour and temperatures plunging to between 15 and 30 degrees below zero. Author Joe Wilcox himself later concluded, after analyzing available lowland weather data for his 1981 book on the disaster, that the conditions faced by the climbers still on the upper mountain may have been among the worst any mountaineers have ever recorded surviving through, anywhere in the world. When 2 days passed with no contact from the climbers still near the summit, 3 members of the team, Wilcox, Howard Snyder, and Paul Schlichter, attempted to climb back up from their camp at 15,000 feet to search for the others, but the ongoing storm made meaningful progress impossible. By the time the last survivors reached base camp on July 25th, the remaining 7 members of the expedition, Dennis Lutcherhand, Hank Janes, Walt Taylor, Steve Taylor, John Russell, Mark McLaughlin, and Jerry Clark, were almost certainly already dead. The disaster's aftermath revealed just how limited 1960s-era search and identification technology genuinely was in conditions this extreme. Only 3 of the 7 bodies were ever recovered at all, and even those recoveries didn't resolve who was who. Rescuers, facing remains that had been frozen, buried, and ravaged by weeks of continued exposure on the mountain, had no reliable way to positively identify which climber they'd actually found. Decades before DNA analysis or accessible dental record comparison existed as standard forensic tools. One rescuer involved in the retrieval effort later expressed regret that he hadn't thought to photograph what they found in the moment, reflecting that even a photograph might have eventually given grieving families some form of closure that the recovery effort, as conducted, simply couldn't provide. The tragedy has never fully escaped a lingering undercurrent of blame and disputed interpretation in the decades since. Some in the climbing community, including the respected mountaineering cartographer and Denali expert Bradford Washburn, had voiced concerns about aspects of the Wilcox Expedition's organization and team dynamics even before the climb began, and the merger of 2 originally separate, loosely affiliated groups at the last minute has been cited by later researchers, including journalist Andy Hall, whose own father had been the last National Park Service ranger to see the team alive and intact, as a contributing factor in the communication breakdowns that unfolded once the storm hit. Hall spent 5 years investigating the disaster for his book Denali's Howl, tracking down surviving witnesses and previously lost documents and recordings decades after the fact, and even his exhaustive research concluded that some of what happened at 17,900 feet in those final days will likely never be fully, definitively reconstructed. It remains, more than half a century later, the deadliest single mountaineering disaster in American history, and it stands as one of this journey's clearest illustrations of a genuinely unresolved case that requires no supernatural explanation whatsoever to remain harrowing. 7 experienced young climbers, caught by what may have been record-setting weather, on a mountain that today has hosted more than 22,000 successful summits and still, every single season, tests the limits of what modern equipment, modern forecasting, and modern rescue capability can actually guarantee. Every human story this journey has covered, Russian, indigenous, gold rush, Cold War, and everything since, sits on top of a far older mystery, one measured in tens of thousands of years rather than centuries. During the last ice age, roughly between 28,000 and 18,000 years ago, sea levels dropped low enough to expose a vast landmass connecting Siberia to Alaska, called Beringia, estimated at its widest to have been roughly the size of modern Australia. Far from the barren ice sheet many people picture, sediment cores drilled into the now submerged landscape indicate Beringia was actually a shrub tundra environment, similar to parts of Arctic Alaska today, dominated by low willow and birch, with some sheltered pockets even supporting stands of spruce trees where local conditions ran slightly milder than the surrounding steppe. For most of the 20th century, the standard account held that the ancestors of Native American peoples crossed this land bridge in a relatively swift, direct migration roughly 13,000 years ago, associated with a distinctive style of stone spear point called Clovis technology found widely across North America. More recent genetic and archaeological research has complicated that picture substantially. A hypothesis called the Beringian standstill, developed from genetic evidence, proposes that a population of Proto-Americans actually migrated out of Asia and then remained settled within Beringia itself for as long as 10,000 years, effectively paused partway through their journey, before ever continuing on into the Americas. A theory researchers have advanced specifically to reconcile genetic data, suggesting a long population isolation period with the frustrating scarcity of archaeological sites actually found in the region, since so much of the land bridge itself now sits permanently underwater, taking whatever physical evidence it once held down with it. Genomic research has identified a distinct population researchers call ancient Beringians, who appear to have split off from other early American lineages around 20,000 years ago and are connected to what's called the Denali Complex, a set of related archaeological sites found across Alaska and dated to between roughly 12,500 and 6,000 years ago, meaning the very landscape at the center of this entire journey's namesake has its own separate, ancient archaeological identity entirely distinct from the modern triangle this series has spent so long examining. Some of the clearest physical evidence for early human presence in this specific corner of Alaska comes from a site called Swan Point, in the state's interior, where stone tools have been dated to approximately 14,000 years ago, among the oldest confirmed evidence of human activity anywhere in Alaska. Genetic research has also revealed that this ancient migration was never simply a one-way journey. A study analyzing skeletal remains found evidence that people moved back from Alaska into North Asia as well, with some Siberian populations today still carrying traces of Native American ancestry in their genomes passed down from these reverse migrations, some occurring as recently as roughly 1,000 years ago, long after the physical land bridge itself had already vanished beneath the rising sea, and travel between the two continents required boats rather than dry land at all. It's a genuinely strange thought to sit with, this close to the end of tonight's journey. Long before Hale Boggs's plane vanished, long before the Tlingit fought the Russians at Sitka, long before 100,000 prospectors walked toward the Klondike, and long before any radar station or aircraft or theory ever needed a stretch of Alaskan wilderness to disappear into an entire vanished world called Beringia was already sitting exactly where the Bering Strait is today, populated by people whose full story remains only partially recovered, mostly because the ground they once walked on is no longer ground at all. It may be the oldest, largest, and most genuinely unsolved mystery this entire region has ever held, and it has nothing to do with government secrecy or cryptids or vanishing compasses. It's simply the ordinary, humbling fact that an entire chapter of human history sank beneath the ocean before anyone thought to write any of it down. We've covered a great deal of ground tonight, literally in the case of a state larger than Texas, California, and Montana combined. It's worth gathering the full shape of what we've walked through before we close. We began with the boundaries of the triangle itself, and the disappearance of Hale Boggs and Nick Begich in 1972, a case that remains genuinely unresolved to this day, layered with everything from Warren Commission conspiracy theories to the strange footnote of Begich winning re-election while officially still missing. We traced the aviation statistics that explain so much of the region's danger without needing anything stranger than weather, terrain, and a chronic shortage of radar coverage. Figures confirmed independently by the NTSB, the FAA's own capstone program, and decades of CDC occupational data. We sat with the indigenous folklore of the Kushtaka, the Nantianak, and the Inupiat's own Aurora traditions, each a genuine, centuries-old cultural inheritance deserving of respect on its own terms, distinct from the modern media machinery that has repackaged fragments of it into paranormal reality television. We examined the JL 1628 encounter closely, a case substantiated by 3 separate radar systems and credentialed professional witnesses, that still, honestly, remains unresolved by the FAA's own final word. We walk through HAARP's real ionospheric research mission and the sprawling conspiracy mythology built on top of it, missing 411's pattern matching and its critics, and the genuine, documented history of Cold War radar infrastructure that once watched this exact sky for a very different kind of threat than any of tonight's legends imagined. And then we went further back, into the Iditarod Trail's century of storms and shelter cabins built specifically to save mushers, exactly like the ones still being rescued today. Into the fog and friendly fire of the Battle of Attu, and the 2,600 soldiers whose remains, even now, are still being recovered from that island's bog. Into the forced, traumatic internment of the Unangax people, a chapter of American history that displaced entire villages permanently and killed 1 in 10 of those interned. A tragedy with nothing mysterious about it beyond how little it's still discussed today. Into the gold rush's own avalanche and disease and violence, predating every modern layer of this story by a full century. Into the pipeline boom that built and broke Fairbanks almost overnight, and the spill at Bly Reef that followed 12 years later. Into the Wilcox expedition's 7-day storm on Denali, and finally, into Beringia itself, a lost world, populated by people whose full story is still being pieced together, that sank beneath the ocean waves before anyone thought to write any of it down at all. What ties every one of these threads together isn't a vortex, a secret weapon, or a hidden species. It's simply this: Alaska is enormous, genuinely wild, and has been swallowing people, ships, planes, villages, and entire ancient landscapes for as long as anyone has been keeping records, and for a very long time before that. Some of what's been lost here has real, satisfying answers, arrived at slowly, decades later, through patient forensic work and sonar and DNA analysis. Some of it, like the Carol A. Deering's Bermuda Triangle cousin cases, or Flight 19's wreckage, or 7 climbers on Denali, or JL 1628's radar contact, may never be fully explained at all. Both kinds of story are worth holding on to. Neither one needs the other's help to remain genuinely remarkable. There are other fences, other quiet edges of the map, waiting for other nights. Somewhere in the Atlantic, we've already walked the waters between Florida, Bermuda, and Puerto Rico and separated the genuinely unexplained from the merely retold. Somewhere beyond even that, we'll spend a night with the biggest question of all. Not just one triangle of ocean or one triangle of wilderness, but the far larger question of whether anyone else is out there in the universe at all, and what it would actually take scientifically to ever know for certain. You don't have to remember any of it tonight. That's what tomorrow night is for. This has been the Sleepy Scholar. Sleep well.